Welcome to 21st Century Saints, live with your host, Jane Christie. We don't have Alana with us tonight. We have our guest co-host, the wonderful Peter Bleakley. Peter, do you want to say hi? And for those who are just joining us for the first time or have been living under a rock, do you want to tell everyone a little bit about who you are?
I'm not that famous. Hi, I'm Peter Bleakley. I run the Mormon Civil War podcast. It's a real pleasure to be here. I thoroughly enjoyed your last episode with Dr. Greaves, and just super excited for the subject matter this evening. I think it's very important from a spiritual and an intellectual point of view, and I'm really looking forward to this. So thank you so much for inviting me to join you. It's a great pleasure.
It's so good of you to be here. And Dr. Sheldon Greaves, would you like to say hi and just reintroduce yourself?
Sure, Jane. It's a pleasure to be here. I thoroughly enjoyed the last time we were here together. My name is Sheldon Greaves. I have a PhD in Ancient Near Eastern Studies from Berkeley. My area of emphasis was the Hebrew Bible. I like to describe myself as a guerrilla scholar because I can't stay in any one lane for very long. And I also describe myself as a retired Mormon, since they haven't kicked me out yet, but I've kind of walked away and I haven't bothered to take my name off. And I'm not entirely sure where that leaves me, so I just say I'm retired. And you might say I'm pursuing a second career as an Episcopalian these days. So, but I do have an interest in what's going on in the Mormon community. And I'm delighted to be part of this podcast today.
And I think your status actually reflects a lot of where most people on church records actually find themselves, just kind of, you're not particularly deciding to do anything. There's not, you don't feel obliged to get in touch with church leadership and demand answers and things, which was really interesting. That would be really interesting. Peter, you are instructed to please jump in at all. Don't feel that you have to restrain your questions because
okay. Be careful what you wish for.
I'm a groupie. I'm a fangirl of Dr.
I'm here to learn.
Well, yeah, I kind of just want.
We all are.
Yeah.
So
I'm just realised I'm in disguise as Lynn. I forgot to change the I have no idea how to change that setting.
I totally missed that.
Yeah. This is my alter ego.
Dr. Greaves first had come to my attention when you were doing the Rational Faiths blog podcast, I believe it was, with Miguel and the team there, and it was so good. I found it when 4 years ago we were doing the Old Testament cycle as part of Mormon Sunday School. And I had never heard it called the Hebrew Bible once. I'd never heard which is weird to me now. So because everything was sort of recontextualized and it was a different way of looking at things, it was suddenly exciting and vibrant, to the point where if someone is saying the Old Testament, I'm not looking forward to hearing this stuff again. It's crazy to me now because I feel like you've given me the tools to, or things that I can work with. So I've come prepared tonight.
Yes.
I know that you do too, Peter. And what I want to kick off with is actually, would it be okay if I show the audience? Now let me just see if I can share this. So I'm podcasting from Glasgow. Alana and I live just outside of Glasgow, and history, storytelling, myth it's really part of our culture. We are brought up with stories that I don't think we really realize just how much it affects our identity. So I want to show you this. Now let me just, you guys can let me know if this doesn't work. I should be able to bring this up. Okay. I will be one moment. I'm still getting used to how
Hey, high tech, exciting.
Yeah, you know what?
Share that screen.
Okay, so can you guys see that? Is that coming up on the screen now?
No,
No.
I'm still seeing you.
Anything, I'm afraid.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think we tried this before and it didn't work. So here we go. This okay. Right. Okay. So what I wanted to show you guys was this.
Oh wow.
Wow.
In Glasgow, we have a mural trail, and this is maybe about 5 years old. So this is a modern depiction of the patron saint of Glasgow, Saint Mungo. And there are stories and songs about him. He is perched on his finger. There is the bird that never flew, a robin who legend tells us that the robin was dead and that he brought the robin back to life. There are a few different sort of stories that he's demonstrated miraculous powers, but he's depicted here as a homeless man. And his co-patron of the city is Saint Enoch, and she's depicted modern sort of with modern imagery here, and she is nursing her child. Now, a slight trigger warning whenever I tell you a little bit about who she is. Saint Enoch or Saint Tanu or Tanu or Tanuk. We have lots of different ways of pronouncing her name. She is the mother of Saint Mungo, who we just saw. She's depicted as nursing him. The bird that never flew is perched on her wrist too. She is, legend tells us that she is Scotland's first recorded rape victim. And when she was raped by her cousin, who had come to her in disguise, her father discovered that she was pregnant and was furious. So she's also Scotland's first recorded domestic violence victim. She was thrown from a high hill where miraculously she survived and was protected, where she was taken to an island where St Mungo was raised. Now those depictions there are part of we'll just try and get rid of that now and come back to you guys. Sorry, I'll just be one moment. Yeah, it's part of our culture. So we still today sing songs. We still, we walk past this as we go shopping. The schools are sort of named after these patron saints, and it really fascinates me that we keep that part of our story, and we don't always do that. I feel like we have this sort of binary, if something's legend, fable, myth, creation story, we want to either to be true or not true. At no point have I ever heard in my life someone asking, did St Enoch really exist? Was he really a person? Where can I find more about the records of him? And there are lots and lots of historical records, oral tales and things like that. Alana and I were having a conversation back when her faith journey had sort of first started, and we were talking about the story of Adam and Eve, and I remember Alana just looking at me in horror and asking, oh, does that mean Adam and Eve isn't true? And look, my answer to everything is it's complicated, but I wanted to kick off with that idea
That'll
of
do.
Dr. Greaves, because I don't
Lana.
want to just say, it's not true. So the church holds on to an idea of a literal Adam and Eve. Can we responsibly believe that there was literally two beings called Adam and Eve? What do we do with that creation story? So would you maybe kick us off and share some of your thoughts?
Yeah. Well, the thing is, stories like that, I mean, technically in the scholarly world, we'll call them myths, but that word is so loaded that it's almost, unusable in some cases. But my sense is that stories like that they're not true and they're not false. They are close or not close to our lived experience. They tell us something about ourselves and about what we consider to be the way the world works. I mean, here's something that actually I was thinking about just this morning. Don't ask me why, but there it is. We're talking about origin stories, right? And I was noticing that in Japanese science fiction, when you have an accidental release of dangerous radiation, you get monsters like Godzilla. But in the United States, when you have a dangerous release of radiation, you get superheroes like the Hulk, or in the original comic, Spider-Man was bitten by a radioactive spider, and later they change it to a genetically modified spider, because that's more timely. But I think there's something significant there. It tells us a little something about what those respective cultures feel about, all things nuclear. I mean, it's pretty easy to understand why the Japanese would see radiation as monstrous, but it's also interesting to see that in the United States, it's almost heroic, So they have this power to convey things and to get us thinking about, in terms of metaphors and in terms of how we think about various things. And metaphors, that's another subject for something later. But and I want to go back to your point about, did these saints really exist? I mean, try to imagine Jesus telling his story about the prodigal son, and he gets to the end of it, and he's done, and then somebody in the audience pipes up, "Oh yeah, I knew that guy. He was a real asshole." No, you missed the point. Stories are like models. So like in engineering and mathematics and physics, if you're trying to understand something really complex, you make a mathematical model of it. If you're trying to build a bridge, you build a mathematical model, and then you can feed numbers in, you can change the load, you can change the winds and all this sort of thing, and you can see how that model reacts. But the model is of necessity simpler than the reality. It's not the reality. In fact, at some point it's wrong, which is why one model is never enough. You need several models working from different angles so that you can understand the nature of something that otherwise is very complex and hard to understand. Narratives are also models, and they're models for helping to understand aspects of our very complicated lives and the interrelationships and the relationships that we have to deal with every day. So when so what you see in the ancient world is you see people using stories to set up a situation that either explains the way things are, or the way it the way things could be, or what are the mechanisms behind what's going on. For instance, Jesus has this story about the people in the vineyard, right? The vineyard workers, and how the vineyard master, he calls these people in, at the early day, and then in the middle he finds some more laborers and he brings them in, and at the end of the day he brings a few more in, but everybody gets paid the same. Now there are some people who will interpret that and say, oh, that's an expression of God's love, for everybody who comes in. But someone else, I've seen, has very credibly made the argument that Jesus is in fact uncovering a mechanism by which wealthy employers sow division among their employees and keep them divided and keep them from banding together and basically keeping them in their place. And he makes a pretty good argument for it. So sometimes the only way to really explore one story is with another story, and they keep building on each other and building on each other. Now, this is like massively true in Jewish scripture, where you have the Bible, you have the Torah, you have the prophets and the writings, but what most people who aren't part of the Jewish community don't realize is that that's just the basis of this huge body of interpretive literature, most of it consisting of stories called the Midrash, where you take a little piece of a scripture and then you build a story on top of that to make another point. And some of these can get, like real wild and crazy, and some of them are just utterly charming, and some of them are impenetrable. Like, what is he talking about? But that's kind of how it works. Our lives and the circumstances that control them, they're best described with stories. And that's kind of the way we've always worked. Think of it. When you grow up, you don't really need to go to school to learn how to appreciate a story. But you do need to take a class if you're going to use mathematical models. We don't do that naturally. That's not something that's innate with us. So yeah, it's just part of the way humans have always interacted with the world.
And I think it's tough when someone gives you a manual and
Mm-hmm.
points you to these stories, and here are the types of questions that you could ask, and here are the conclusions that you could reach.
Mm-hmm.
And it leaves very little room for creativity. I think the idea of Midrash really excites me, but I don't know that I have the tools to be able
Mm-hmm.
to do that, because we've been taught in such a binary way. Now, I remember Alana and I, a couple of years ago, okay, so this would have been maybe 8 years ago. There
Mm-hmm.
was a performance of the 10 virgins, the parable of the 10 virgins, set to music as part of a fireside. Absolutely beautiful. A lot of the sort of feminist Mormon blogger knackle have ripped this to shreds. It's not a well loved one. But when I first performed this, so we have each woman in the story is given some kind of reason why she either makes it or doesn't make it. She sings a song about, in my case, I'm cast as the woman who didn't quite have the time to get the oil, but I do really good intentions. And it gets to the end of the performance, and I was wrecked. As I was practicing it, I'm like, hold on, this is my life. And it was absolutely devastating for me. Everyone was spiritually uplifted. About maybe, what would it have been, 4 years ago, someone else decides, let's redo this, let's bring this back. And I was really not looking forward to it, but I knew I'd had a spiritual experience, when we'd originally done it. But this time Alana's there, and Alana has all of these questions, and she asks questions in such an exciting way. And you know, it was so easy to want to just reject this whole story as being a toxic experience. Except the second time around, what we were able to do was sort of say, you know, we were able to, I was able to pull it apart, see what makes it work. And while the church, what I had been taught is the right answer is I have to be prepared. My good intentions aren't enough. I have to be prepared. No one else can fill my lamp for me. You know, I'm experimenting with ideas this time, like, is it possible that running out into the marketplace was completely the wrong thing to do? Maybe I just needed to trust the bridegroom's mercy, that he was going to, you know, that everything would be okay. Um, and that was such an empowering thing to, I think, to be able to take these stories and do something with them that isn't necessarily, you know, so I'm having a connection to it, and academically it's really interesting. How do I learn, how do I gain the tools to be able to do that, Dr. Greaves? How does one begin the steps of being able to midrash the hell out of a story?
Oh, well, you know, it sounds to me like you've made a pretty good start right there. But I mean, the way Midrash works is, you know, you take some little tiny piece and then you expand on it. So one of my favorites is in the Book of Exodus. Moses is being confronted, or he's talking to God, and God calls him to rescue Israel. And Moses says, I can't do this. I'm a poor speaker. I have, you know, I am of a slow tongue. I don't speak well. So someone takes that little piece about Moses not speaking well, and they make a story out of it. And that story is when Moses was a baby and was presented to the Pharaoh, there was some concern that he might, in fact, be the deliverer, because I mean everyone knew where he came from, and so they wanted to test him to see if he was, you know, if he was the sort of person who might, you know, aspire to power. So they put in front of him a hot coal and a great big red ruby, and they would to see which one he would pick. And Moses was reaching for the ruby, but God prompted him to grab the coal instead. And of course, being a baby, he put it in his mouth, you know, and that's why he had, you know, the slow tongue and all that sort of thing. But then the overall lesson is that God will do what is necessary to protect those people who are going to, you know, are going to help him. Now, of course, the literal truth of that is like, no, of course not. But as we have said many times before, history is not the point. History is being used to make a point. And in this instance, I would substitute narrative for history, because you know, that kind of makes it a little more generic and a little more broadly applicable, as it should be. But that's an example of Midrash, and we don't do that.
Well, yeah, we don't, because it feels, and it felt to me like I was being maybe a little bit sacrilegious. I felt like I was almost needed permission to be able to pull that story apart and reach a conclusion that maybe I hadn't heard before.
Right.
Peter, what are your thoughts on that too? Isn't it when how do we give ourselves permission to?
I think where one way to sort of Mormon-splain this is to say there are many aspects of Mormonism that do give you permission, and it is a tangled mess, and the stakes could not be higher, because as I hope we'll explain as we go with this dialogue, this is really the future of religion. If religion is going to survive, it's going to have to cope, particularly fundamentalist religions like Mormonism, are going to have to cope with nuancing the hell up a lot about a lot of stuff, while somehow holding on to truth claims and a belief in God. And this is so difficult to navigate, which is why religions have tended to polarize between fundamentalists and those who embrace this kind of nuance and perspective. And what I'm always looking for is, how can Mormonism survive into the future, you know, take its best stuff forward with integrity, not by stopping being itself, you know. So I've grown up in a religion where people love the analogy, the metaphor, the story. Like, you can't have a testimony meeting without or a talk without people telling a story that teaches a message and is not claiming to be real history or real events. So I think Mormons, on a positive, are highly educated in analogy and metaphor and symbolism in storytelling and how to use that to teach something. I think the waters have been muddied, sadly, by general authorities claiming things as truth that weren't, in all kinds of ways, you could say, from the Restoration onwards, depending on your point of view. And we've had Paul H. Dunn, who just ran with this, where he made up, you know, books full of stories that were totally not true, but sold the religion on the basis of them, and encouraged people to have spiritual experiences and witnesses of the truth of our church based on telling lies while claiming they were truth. So I think for nuanced and skeptical and educated and informed Mormons, this whole area has been poisoned severely just by liars. And addressing the lies people tell in these situations is a part of learning about religious history in any religion or journey. So I think reclaiming something back from that and trying to undo the harm is a challenge that we face with engaging Mormons with this whole area, because your first sort of steps of faith deconstruction are finding out you got lied to by a load of stuff by people you trusted. And for most people, that is too much. That's it. They can't trust these people ever again, and they can't trust this institution ever again because it lied to them. It claimed things that were true, and knowingly. You know, this isn't sinning by accident. It's people intentionally telling us a false narrative. And with that, they lose their connection to God, and they don't trust religion again in many, many cases. And that's by far the majority experience of Latter-day Saints, because 80% of them leave by age 30, often through that kind of a process. So from my point of view, this could not be more important, which is partly why I'm super excited to be having a discussion about this, because we have to snatch something from the fire of that disappointment and betrayal and the lies, if Mormonism, or any religion really, you could say, because the same cycles occur in all faiths, is going to have a future. And how do we bring that about? And it's been a real intense personal journey for me to get my head around how I could possibly make this work. And, you know, as appropriate, I don't want to hog the whole show, but I've got a few things that have meant a lot to me to help me do that. And I'm really excited to hear how you know, Dr. Greaves has also gone on that journey. But I'll just add at this point to my point that Mormons do love metaphor and simile. We're really good at it. That the endowment, for example, the temple endowment is about presenting a foundation story, a creation myth. It is, we do this. This is like huge in our religion, far more than many other Christians do in lots of ways. That we make this our highest religious experience, in a sense, that most members get to have. And it's all metaphor, it's all myth, it's all literally origin story. And it's presented in a way that we're encouraged to get different messages from each time we go. That we're meant to take our questions to the temple and somehow find an answer in it, in the same way we do with the scriptures. That it may mean something completely different to you next month to what it meant to you last month, and what it's going to mean to you in a few years, because you start to see different things in it. And I've certainly experienced that with the endowment and appreciated that. So I think my starting point here is to let's own, embrace, and celebrate the fact that within certain limitations, Mormons are great at this and have the potential to scale up from that in the way that Dr. Sheldon is talking about, how the Jewish religion has, how a lot of mainstream Christian denominations have. And we're really late to this party when it comes to biblical literalism and so on. But at the same time, acknowledging part of the thrill of Mormonism is at least the initial belief that you don't have to play those games, because that's all just the worldly corruption. They've given up their faith. They've stopped believing it's real. We got the Book of Mormon to prove that the Tower of Babel happened, to prove that the Bible was true all along. I mean, that's what I grew up on. It was thrilling. It's like we can save that aspect of Christianity. We can bring back the literalism of the Bible, because this whole other civilization says the same stuff. Jesus was real, Moses was real, Noah was real, Adam and Eve were real, and it's like, yeah, we can be fundamentalists and take it all literally. So there's a lot there to unpack, to understand. And I'll just, sorry, my second final thing on that is I got lucky in that when I don't even remember who it was, but usually before you go for your first endowment, you have an interview with the member of the temple presidency and they have a chat. And that was the time, and I think it's maybe a tradition in the British temples, certainly the London temple. I was told what you're going to see is symbolic. It's a metaphor for things. It's not the literal history. And what a great gift to me that I've never had to have this crisis, because I was told from the start this aspect of storytelling, which includes the story of the Garden of Eden and Adam and Eve, is a metaphor. I was told from the start that this is something you can interpret in different ways. And that was such a blessing. Now, because it's Mormonism, there are other layers. For example, there is a phrase, or there used to be in the endowment, that what you're going to see is figurative. I can't remember what the exact wording is. And some of the historians are saying that that's something Brigham Young introduced because he believed in Adam God. And this story we're about to be told isn't the Adam God theory. It's a different narrative. And that he put that in there saying, well, this isn't the real truth, but my idea about Adam God really is the truth. So as always with Mormonism, the more you learn, the more you get historical research, you find these layers. But anyway, I'm sticking with my one because that worked for me. So I think I would just begin by saying, hey, Mormons, we can do this. We already do it in a lot of ways, but we have some stuff to navigate. We have to work out what is it we're expecting of truth claims. Can we hold on to the important truth claims? Or because the common default statement in a lot of post-Mormon dialogues, which is completely reasonable, is, well, I'll just read Lord of the Rings then. I'll read Shakespeare. Like, it's much more interesting to read than the Book of Mormon. And it's actually arguably got more depth in it in lots of ways. So
Wonder
there's no
Woman
point.
is sacred. The movie Wonder Woman.
There you go.
Is sacred. It's sacred to me. Yes.
So we need to, if you're going to have a religion, it has to be more than just, we've got great stories. Pay us 10% of tithing, marry in this way, hate these people because of it, make these sacrifices of your time because we have good metaphors. It's like, well, no, I can get that watching telly. So we do have to somehow maintain a connection to deeper universal truth, connection with God, whatever you want to call it. And we can do that, of course, as I'm sure you understand, Dr. Greaves.
Yeah.
But, so I just wanted to sort of map out there sort of some of my thoughts on this whole thing and what we face as Mormons, particularly navigating it.
No, you're right. Well, you know, the doctrine. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was going to ask, in your response, would you be able to address the idea that is really offensive to a lot of members of the church about, could you define what myth is and how we're using it in this context? Because it sounds to many members of the church at first that when we use terms like myth, we're saying this is not true and we need it to be true. So could you maybe speak to that, will you?
Sure. A myth is it's a narrative that describes some aspect of lived experience. So it can be something like why the world is the way it is, why bad people prosper and good people have horrible things that happen to them. It can explain, you know, various things about like why there are men and women, or you know, why animals are afraid of people, or, you know, any of those sorts of things. And not all myths are created equal, obviously. Some of them are very informative and insightful, and you can take them and expand them and go into, you know, in various directions. And so I'm thinking, like, for instance, Homer, the character Odysseus. if you look him up in like a dictionary of mythology, you'll discover that there are like 4 or 5 different ways that Odysseus meets his end, is killed. There are like 4 or 5 different stories of how he was killed, but it was almost always some son of one of his many paramours, that eventually caught up with him and did him in. So it's not something, as I said before, it's not something that's either true or false. The value of a myth is its proximity to our lived experience and how well it describes that. I'm thinking too, like, for example, when Jesus is giving his parables, there's a statement I'm trying to think, is it in Matthew, where it says, and everybody was amazed at his teaching because he taught with authority, not as one of the scribes. And I think what they mean by that is people listened to his parables and said, oh my gosh, he's describing my life. He's describing what's happened. I've seen that. I know what he's talking about. So that's where it really starts to get valuable. Now, I want to just back up a minute here. Doug Vinson asks the question, could the Book of Mormon be a humongous midrash? Absolutely. In fact, there was a paper that appeared, I want to say it was in Dialogue, it was a number of years ago, that made precisely that argument. I think the guy got excommunicated over it. I may be wrong about that, but which just kind of goes to your point, Peter, which is kind of ironic, really, because you're right. We are great at metaphors and similes and stories and all that kind of stuff, but there's like this hard line when it comes to the Book of Mormon. We can't treat it like a story or anything like that, which is really ironic, because if you go back and you look at the writings of both the Christian fathers and the medieval and early rabbis, both of them warn people, when you read this stuff, don't get too literal, because it will put you in an impossible situation. You'll end up, and what I find so funny is that these situations are very often of their own, of someone's own making. It actually has nothing to do with what the text actually says. When they're being literal, they're actually distorting the text. So, for example, online recently, I don't normally indulge in this sort of thing, but there was some, white nationalist, white supremacist who was, going on about, the Jewish conspiracy and everything, and just like it says in the Bible. And I typed in, you do know that Bible was written by Jewish people, right? And and in his response, I learned several new swear words. That was
so, we can help with that.
Oh yeah, I'm sure. Oh, you guys are masters.
Our goal is
to
get every guest to start saying cockwomble. Then we've succeeded.
Oh, I love that one. Yes. Yes, that's brilliant. So
fans who are actually keeping notes on new swear words that they discover.
we get a lot of fan mail extending people's vocabulary.
Yeah. But another thing that you mentioned too, you're talking about Genesis. Mormons are just nuts about Genesis. I mean, think of how many versions we have of the Genesis creation story. We have the one in the Bible. There's one in the Book of Abraham. There's one in the Book of Moses, and there's the temple ceremony. And it just strikes me as interesting that we keep going back to that, or at least Joseph Smith kept going back to it. And the interesting question for me is, what was he seeing there that made this so important to him? And that's a great line of thinking. That's a great way to go in. Book of Mormon, I dearly wish that people would take it as, the technical term would be pseudepigrapha, which is kind of a difficult term, because that pseudo prefix kind of throws people off, and you can
So,
have.
so to translate, I'm a secondary school teacher, so I'm used to taking children from total ignorance to knowing a bit about something. Like today was don't slap each other in the head while filming it on your camera. So we're baby steps, and so pseudepigrapha is am I correct in saying that is where you write something in the name of someone else? So you would
Right.
write a letter from Paul. You're not Paul the apostle, but you're writing it in his name, either as a
Right.
pure act of deception or as a homage to say I'm of the school of Paul, or I'm the school of Moses or John, that his philosophy is something I resonate with, and this is what else I think he might have said. So it can be done as an act of sacred reverence for their ideas. Or fan fiction is the term that gets used a lot in Mormondom and the Bloggernacle. Is the Book of Mormon biblical fan fiction, or scholars would call it pseudepigrapha, writing in the name of another name, a person.
I want to give a shout out here to Sarah Elizabeth. This thing about the Book of Mormon, reframed it as a story of American social and political life, in the same way it was Jesus taught by the story of telling parables. A freaking men. I think the Book of Mormon is really dead on a number of things involving social and economic and political tensions within a society, particularly a modern society. I also really like the fact that it takes a very dim view of wars of aggression and a number of other things. It's, I mean, if Mormons would actually, read the Book of Mormon and read it, without trying to, prove, find the exact location of Zarahemla, or recover fossils of curlums and kumums and all that kind of thing, we would be much further ahead, I think, than we are, But
can I just sort of push back a little bit on that statement?
Sure.
I absolutely get what you mean by in the sense of trying to take it all scientifically, literally, and there's all kinds of anachronisms. There's things that just don't work with the historical record for the Americas. But I do think Mormons do. I think part of the reason that Latter-day Saints and Mormons of all stripes love the Book of Mormon and resonate with it is because they do get these messages from it. Whether it's coming from a position of it's all literal true history, wonderful, but we're always trained in the church, apply this to your own life. What's the message here? What's the moral of this story, and how can you live it? So I think what you've really, and I really appreciate that, I think what you've identified there is something that I think is a component of Mormons' passion for the Book of Mormon, which is why they hold on to it so tightly, even under a torrent of archaeological or other evidence that can be interpreted as really discrediting it. It's because they have built their lives on those stories. They've taken them seriously. They've taken them as wisdom to live by, and they do enjoy it. So I just want to sort of push back that I think maybe that perhaps that statement needs nuancing a bit. That
I think you're right. No, I agree with you.
They do get those stories. They're passionate about them, and they profoundly impact their lives. They get life-changing messages from it, as they do from the Bible and so on. But I also understand sort of where you're coming from. That
when you take the literal approach, it confers a sort of certainty.
Yeah.
And certainty is a hell of a drug. The question is, can you transition a way where you still have the life lessons, but you're not addicted to this need for this kind of rational certainty. In other words, I guess our question now is what's the Mormon methadone, that will wean us off that and be able to, so are you guys are probably familiar with the, what was his name? Paulson. He wrote an article in one of the very early issues of Dialogue called "What the Church Means to People Like Me," and he describes two models of Mormons.
Keep nodding, Jane. We'll pretend we read this stuff.
I know.
Yes.
Oh yes, of course, Paulson. You're right. Yes,
Yeah.
Paulson. Yeah.
The Iron Rod Mormons and the Liahona Mormons,
Yes. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
and so the Iron Rod Mormons are gripping, and the Liahona Mormons are more kind of nuancing it. And I used to describe the correlation program as a systematic effort to grease the iron rod. But
Yeah.
but yeah, I think that's kind of what we're coming back to here. And I find that those two metaphors, it's funny, they both appear in the Book of Mormon. And in fact, they both appear in very close proximity to each other. And I guess, the iron rod will work up to a point, but you can only go where that iron rod leads. There might be other places that are just as valuable. And for that, you're going to need something else. You're going to have to let go. So,
and that's kind of in my podcast. I frame things as Pharisaical Mormonism or Christian Mormonism, but based on the same idea. You've got the rigidity, the one size fits all, or you've got the individual on their journey to truth and with more flexibility, and kind of what Jesus taught more. Yeah. Hi.
So
being invaded.
Right.
Why do we? Every culture has its creation myths, right? Why is the biblical Hebrew Bible? Why are some creation myths so enduring? Scottish creation myths, Celtic creation myths are, they're there. They haven't. They're still sort of existing. Even if you try to find them online, it's actually really quite difficult. They're still very much oral. So they haven't endured in the same way. And of course, Christianity displaced a lot of so they have their place. Why are some so enduring, and what things do the creation myths tend to have in common?
Okay, boy, that's a huge question, and it's juicy as hell. The Genesis creation is actually quite remarkable, because we need to set the stage here first, because the Genesis creation story as we have it reached its final form while the Jews were in exile in Babylon. Now, the function of a creation story in the ancient Near East, at least on the national level, it was a kind of political statement. It was a means for a nation to announce itself and to define itself, and to describe what they considered to be their essential values, what they considered to be their basic institutions. They're basic because they were there from the foundation of the world, and they're divinely appointed. And it also is a statement about how we're going to run the world. This is how we think society and the world and God and all that is supposed to work. Because back in that time, the political order and the natural order were believed to be two sides of the same coin. If there were disasters, natural disasters, it was probably because there was something bad that was happening with the leader and the rulers and so on. And I believe even in Celtic mythology, there's a tradition where if things get bad enough, the king could be ritually killed in order to remove, the bad mojo and start things up over again. So, and creation stories also had a ritual function. So you would recite a creation story at the new year as a way of ritually recreating the world and starting everything fresh. So that's where Judaism is, where the Genesis creation is coming from. Now, Genesis, I believe the Genesis story is in fact half of a debate that's going on with the Babylonian worldview, which politically was, the dominant one. I mean, Babylon had destroyed Jerusalem, destroyed the temple, basically wiped out the royal dynasty, all that sort of thing. And here are these Jews in exile, and the story, the creation narrative that the Babylonians are using is this thing called the Enuma Elish, where you have the dominant god Marduk, who is one of the younger gods, and the older gods are threatening to kill the younger gods, and the younger gods band together. Marduk leads them. I'll lead you to victory if you give me total power. They go. Marduk kills the chaos goddess Tiamat, and then he creates the cosmos out of her slain carcass, and then he sets up his the institutions that define how he's going to run things. He's a king. He runs a palace. There are alliances. The good guys get rewarded. The bad guys are punished, sort of. The leader of the rebellious gods is killed, and humans are made kind of as an afterthought to do all the dirty work out of the blood of this slain god mixed with clay. Okay, so Genesis is totally pushing back on that. God just is there. There's no coterie, there's no alliances, none of that sort of thing. He doesn't have to fight anybody. He just speaks and it happens, and it's there. And gradually the world, comes together, and at the end of the day, and this is kind of a funny thing, because in Christianity, Genesis 1 is typically viewed as the creation of the world, creation of the cosmos. But if you talk to people in Judaism, Genesis 1 isn't about the creation of the cosmos. That's not the main point. The main point is that it's the creation of the Sabbath. And their crowning institution is that everybody gets a day off once a week. Instead of humans are slaves to do the work of the gods, no, they get a day off every week, and God, that's divinely appointed, and there's no disputing it. Also, after the world is created, that's when the Creator God usually establishes their symbolic representation of the essential institution. So Marduk, he creates the world, and he builds a palace, because that's how he's going to run. He's going to rule based on military prowess and political strength and, frankly, institutional systemic violence. That's how he runs. That's how he rolls. God creates the world and then creates the essential institution for his rulership, which is a garden. And I think that is massively significant. That this is how the world should be run. This is how it should be. We're not, you don't, have a healthy, thriving society by simply imposing violence on the world. If you're going to survive, it has to be nurturing. It has to be something that is based on growth and the infusion of life, and allowing the animals to multiply and replenish as God told them to, and fill the earth and make it into a living, into something more abundant in terms of life. So, and that's just kind of scratching the surface. And of course, everything later goes sideways, because, not only do humans almost immediately turn out to be carnivorous, they also turn out to be homicidal, and that creates all kinds of problems down the road. So Eden is necessarily, it's an ideal that you're striving for, but the idea is that if you want a healthy working society, you need to create something that embraces life, and where killing is literally not on the menu. I mean, Adam and Eve aren't allowed to kill anything at first. In fact, they're supposed to eat like nuts and fruits. So those are things you gather or pick. They can't even kill plants, until later on. The animals can. They can eat, herbs and trees and stuff like that, but humans can't. It's kind of wild. So, and I think that's part of the significance of Genesis, because it paints this picture of this is how the world is supposed to work. And in a way that makes sense, because the Jews at that time, they're in exile. They don't have access to the usual tools of statecraft. They don't have an army. They don't have a king. They don't have, a massive bureaucracy or anything like that. In fact, even when they got back to Jerusalem, they weren't ruled by a king. There was just the high priest. And that was basically part of the conditions under which they were allowed to return 50 years after the exile, under the Persians. So I look at that and I go, okay, yeah, so this is what Genesis is doing. This is what's happening. But you look at other places in the Middle East. Of course, there's the Babylonian one. There's also the Canaanite creation story that's embedded in something called the Baal cycle, and other things where you still have this battle against chaos, where chaos has to be conquered and beaten, and the only way that you make the world livable is to beat it into submission, basically. And that's you couldn't have a more different way of approaching the world, but that's what they did. Which one was more successful? Well, I think history has answered that question.
The idea of chaos is also in the Celtic mythology, where I think we sort of tend to, we were sort of using our origin myths tended to evolve from the idea of sort of nature and explaining how so we have in the north of Scotland we have this I think it's the world's largest natural whirlpool. So it's this, these churning waters that became the, core or part of the setting of a lot of our origin myths, where it's a portal to the underworld, or it was stirred up by this sort of crone type sort of goddess figure who is ushering in our bad weather. Basically it was explaining why things were so
it's grim up north.
It's and so goddess. I don't even think do we even refer really to them as gods and goddesses? I don't think we tend to. I'm thinking about today. I don't know. I have so much still to learn. But it's fascinating to me that in Glasgow at the moment we've got all of the COP26 going on. We've got the climate change conference, and this idea of the garden and how we're stewards of the planet, that is just so fascinating. I have not heard that.
It's kind of come back, hasn't it? Yeah.
It has. Yeah, that's and this is what I mean about it being it's stimulating and exciting to hear these ideas, that when we open up the new the Old Testament manual at the beginning of the year, it's focused on Pearl of Great Price, and we begin with it's very traditional. It's the same thing we're hearing every cycle.
Can I just say, though, I think Mormonism actually contributes a whole new foundation myth, a new origin myth. And this is one of the things that absolutely thrills me about this religion, and why I think it is intellectually a serious player on the world stage, which a lot of ex-Mormons would be rolling their eyes and like, oh, you're completely delusional, you lunatic. But this is it. Our foundation myth isn't the Garden of Eden. We do attach a lot to it, and we kind of recreate some of it in the endowment, but we also tell the stuff beforehand to some extent. Our creation myth goes way further. So you talked about how a lot of the creation myths of the religions and cultures of the world are about creating order out of chaos, you know, stirring the water in Scotland. I think there's some that it's stirring milk, isn't it? And maybe the Hindu myths, I'm not sure, things like that. And it is that creating order out of chaos. What is fascinating in a way extremely modern is that Joseph Smith channeled, revealed, or invented a foundation myth that explains the entire sort of ethical nature of the universe, that is actually a battle against tyranny, a battle against too much order, a battle against authoritarian dictatorship. And
I like that.
So in the pre-existence, before Adam and Eve and all of that stuff, the story is that God is created his children. He's seeing intelligences with potential to learn and progress, and he's guided them along the way. He's helped them to kind of self-actualize and become something more than they were. They've started to evolve to become more like what he is. And if we factor in Heavenly Mother, who doesn't usually get a mention what they are, and then he engages in a massive theological debate. And it's a democratic process. We are going to choose what our system will be to take the next steps. What will be the plan of salvation? What will be its rules and parameters? And we are offered dictatorship or democracy. We are offered tyranny or freedom. And Lucifer, who is ambitious for power without earning it, he wants the easy shortcut or whatever his motivations are, who's one of our spirit siblings, who started off really well. You know, he's intelligent. He's had, you know, getting there. He's the son of the morning. But he makes a fundamental error, and he offers to take it all away. In effect, he offers dictatorship and certainty. He offers the comfort of the straight and narrow path, the covenant path with exact obedience, the iron rod. He says, if you do exactly what I tell you to do, no one will risk losing anything. You give me your freedom, I will give you a guaranteed end result. Which is a lie, because you can't get to the end result without having the freedom. But he offers what all dictatorships do, that you give away your free thought, give away your freedom, give away your rational analysis, just do as you're told, and we will tell you what to do. We know better than you. I'm the superhuman, I'm the Hitler, I'm the Führer, I'm the dictator, I'm the Saddam Hussein, whoever, the Mao Zedong. And if you do what you're told, everything will be fine, because no one will make any mistakes. There'll be no crime. There'll be no sin. We'll fix humanity's problems, you know, this chaos that God had to deal with in Noah's time, by just taking away the option for you to be that free. And we debated it. We discussed it. We had a war over it. And we're assuming we weren't actually firing guns in each other's faces, but it was a debate. It was an intellectual war, a struggle. And one of the things we're taught in the endowment is this is not a one-off. Lucifer says, I'm just doing what's happened in other worlds. This is a universal process. It's an endlessly repeating cycle. Because the nature of the universe in Mormonism is this struggle between freedom and learning and being a lifelong learner and progressing for yourself, which is intellectual as well as spiritual and ritual, or to people who want power over you, who will actually stop you in your tracks, and disable you from being able to progress by being control freaks, basically. And you couldn't have a more modern idea. The big idea of modern life, there have been some great sort of quite philosophical history documentaries about this, is democracy, the people rebelling against the tyrants, overthrowing the royal families, overthrowing the Babylonians with their palaces, overthrowing the control of the elite and the oligarchy.
Or King George III?
Yes, absolutely. A small blip. Yeah, we came and burnt your White House after that.
Yeah.
And in Britain, we have a great tradition of this as well. You know, whether you want to believe some random guy in a dress screaming about freedom in the north, Or we have the Peasants Revolt in the like really early Middle Ages, which started in my stake in Maidstone Stake, where I grew up.
Oh, wow.
Wat Tyler was from Maidstone, some people think, and rebelled against the king and brought about some changes. And then our civil war against King Charles II. You know, we have a long history here of fighting tyranny, as well as being the tyrants, of course. Sorry about that, everyone. So I think that is super powerful. So if we're on this topic of creation myths, Mormonism in the modern world has the ultimate creation myth, in my opinion. It is fantastic because it's not about power-hungry gods playing with people or making them out of mud or weird sort of tribal things. It's about an incredibly modern and eternal idea: freedom or tyranny. What you're going to have. And all religions and communities and political movements have this tension. They have this civil war between the control freaks and the idealists. And you described how the ideal is this peaceful garden in harmony with nature, without killing and death. But unfortunately, there will always be the other side. There will always be this impulse in people to do it the wrong way or to control other people badly. And I think that then plugs into Doctrine and Covenants 121, which Joseph Smith writes in a few letters while he is experiencing what you've described the Jewish people experiencing in exile. He's in prison, pretty much his own fault if you get into the real history.
Yeah.
But the myth is it's all terribly unjust that he's in prison. And he's experiencing for himself the helplessness of being at the mercy of what he sees as an unjust authority or state system. And he creates this beautiful scripture, and he goes on this journey. He rages, you know, at God. Why are you letting this happen to your people? He quotes Old Testament language, you know, come in your vengeance and punish them and all of that. And God just like, calm down, dude. It's okay. All of that can happen. But here's the real pearl of wisdom to get from this. You cannot save other people by forcing them to be good. You cannot dominate people because of your authority or your status or because you're claiming to be a prophet. The only tools you have to influence others, and these are the divine ways to do it, are persuasion, love, no guile. You can't have an ulterior motive. You have to be completely open about your intentions and your motivations. And the beautiful adjectives that there are in that scripture just melt my heart every time and inspire me. And you can't manipulate. You have to love unconditionally and pure truth. Your only authority is that what you're saying makes sense to people and is persuasive, and they can see you have integrity when you say it because you practice what you preach. You tell them about love and you show them your love. You tell them about service, you show them through your own service. And no power or authority can be maintained or ought to be by ordination, by status, by having a priesthood rank. I mean, that's so powerful. And this is what Jesus taught, Matthew 23. He said, he warned everyone not to even begin letting people have that kind of status or power. He forbade people to give their religious leaders titles. He said, don't call anyone your teacher, your rabbi, your father. Your only teacher is God. And yet Mormonism has ended up turning that into a religious shibboleth. We must call people elder, president, you know, all of these things, which is literally forbidden by Jesus. He says you cannot virtue signal through clothing. These Pharisees, they're wearing the longer tassels than everyone else. They're being super particular about their ritual clothing, and they're showing off, and they're shaming everyone else in comparison. But Mormon culture has absolutely embraced clothing as a true indicator of your spiritual nature. And Jesus literally forbade it. He said you can't even begin down that path. He said, do not give your leaders a privileged seat in the synagogue or at the banquet table. But what do? They're all in ranks at the front on chairs. He
in order of seniority.
In order of seniority. And we put it in our temples, you know, in the priesthood seats in the assembly rooms at the top. So I just get I get so excited about this because this idea is so simple and it's so consistent. And Mormonism at its best, at its worst, screws up totally. You know, it turns everything Jesus forbade about power into how the holy sign that we're doing it right. But when you get the right bits of Mormonism, it absolutely negates all that. It's in harmony with what Jesus taught in Matthew 23. It's in harmony with his rebellion against what the Pharisees had done to his religion. It's in harmony with what Joseph was trying to do in bringing power back to the ordinary people from the priests, from the scholars that he felt had corrupted Christian religion, and saying everyone can receive revelation, everyone can learn, everyone can be a prophet and a priest and a king and a queen, and a priestess. And I just get so excited about that. And that is a metaphor for self-empowerment, for learning yourself, for being a lifelong learner, for being on this eternal journey. And I don't think it's exaggerating to say, I understood that when I was 15, you know, and I wasn't some genius. We were taught this in seminary because it's there. It's there in the story of the pre-existence. That's the point. That's the message. It's there in Matthew 23. It's there in section 121, which we memorized as a seminary student. It's there in D&C 58, another seminary scripture. Be anxiously engaged in good causes. You already have permission from God. If you only do things because because your leaders tell you to, and you do it reluctantly, you're damned, which is how, you know, most things function in the church. And I just, the reason I'm on the rampage now is I'm watching first presidencies of our church and apostles and local leaders picking up on their messaging, teaching the opposite of this, doing the thing we were warned not to. And over again, I hear from people who've left the church, like, do they think we're stupid? We listened when we were 14. They taught us this was wrong in seminary. It's not difficult to understand these principles. And that is why so many people are just heartbroken at the mess we're watching with all this control freakery and cultural doing the opposite of what Mormonism is meant to be. So I'm really excited to sort of get back to what our true principles are. And it is in this origin story. Our origin story is to fight this. Our origin story is right from the very beginning. It's always been about this struggle, all of it. Do not tolerate tyranny, especially if it's wrapped up as priesthood ordination. It's fatal. Don't tolerate it.
I do. So I have a question that I'd like to frame with. It's actually based on the idea of what you're saying. I want to know if we are too enlightened now today to need them, you know, for these origin myths to be relevant, and, you know, specifically the ones in the Pearl of Great Price and the Book of Mormon and the Old Testament and New Testament. We you know, as part of the Ulster cycle creation myths, the Celtic creation myths, the gods or the sort of deities, the nature gods at the time, we didn't have a need for them. They end up becoming sort of resigned to sort of hills and you know, forests and groves and things like that, because humans didn't need them. So do we need them? Are they still relevant? Are we too enlightened for them, Dr. Greaves?
Yeah, you know, the thing is, I think we do need them, but we need to make sure that people understand them in a useful context. I mean, so when most people in the church talk about the Genesis creation story, it's only a matter of time before somebody brings out the question of evolution, and is Genesis, is it or is it not a a faithful description of how the world actually came to be? Well, there are so many things wrong with that I don't even know where to start. You know, I mean, let's say, for example, that you have a curriculum committee for a local school, and instead of the Bible, let's use something a little less loaded. Let's use the play Hamlet. Okay, so a bunch of Hamlet fundamentalists show up to the school board meeting, and they insist that Hamlet needs to be taught in the schools because Hamlet is a perfect description of and history of medieval Denmark. And some English professors from the local university show up and they say, no, Hamlet is not a perfect history of medieval Denmark. And that becomes the axis of the debate. Is it or is it not a great history of medieval Denmark? And lost in all of this is the very real truth that Hamlet is a fantastically insightful description of the human condition. And all that gets lost. So, when someone starts going on about, Genesis and evolution, I just kind of say, go to your room, just no, don't stop. Don't do that, because it's completely missing the point. And the fundamentalists, or I should say the creationists, who are all Christian for some reason. I've never met a Jewish creationist. Isn't that interesting? Because they read it differently. They have a different way of reading it. So
there are lots of Muslim ones. I've got a big book. It's some edifice made by an Islamic pseudo scholar, kind of sort of trying to attack the idea of evolution. So I think these tensions do play out in the other biblical
and they spill over.
Well.
But if we don't kind of set some guardrails a little bit, or at least point people in a useful direction, the stories are going to get lost. And you go to literalism when you don't know how to handle it, when you don't know how to read a story, how to think about a story. And that, I think, is a big part of the problem. So I have a question for you, Peter. I confess I'm not up on what they're teaching kids in seminary these days. And I don't know if you are. I imagine you have a better handle on it than I do. But are they learning the same kinds of things that we were learning back? I mean, are they getting taught about the war in heaven and all that stuff?
Yes, they are. I think so. But certainly about the evolution thing, it's a freaking disaster. That one of the key moments for me in my rage is we had a young man in my last ward who just knew him since childhood, super intelligent, really bright, amazing kids. He'd kind of get up in primary presentations and basically read like an adult, and all the other kids are stumbling on their words, and I was so excited to see what he was going to become in our religion and what he would contribute, because he was the future. Here are these amazing kids we're raising. We encourage them to learn. We're pro-education, and superb. His seminary, I think it's all right to tell the story. His seminary teacher, just an absolutely adorable, heroic, lovely woman, grandmother to everyone, who he adored as much as everyone else did. But the Old Testament bookmark, it's still on the seminary websites. The timeline, 4000 BC, Adam and Eve, Noah, the thing, creation. And they're still teaching the 6,000-year-old Earth timeline with no nuance, with no explanation of how it works with evolution. And I think that's still going on, because Mark Osland did a fantastic Mormon Stories interview series. There's 3 of them, but he was a seminary teacher trying to keep it real. And I think he references some of these things. I mean, I really recommend that. If you're interested in what the kids are being taught in the church these days, it was such a revealing sort of journey that he had and what he talked about. And after one of these lessons where he's being taught this, and he knows perfectly well it's all nonsense, that the earth is millions of years old and so on, his mum told me basically, he came home and he just said, well, that was a load of shit. And that was kind of what broke his shell, or one of the contributing factors. because we couldn't offer a basically intellectual, credible narrative in seminary. And the maddening thing is it's all totally unnecessary. The Mormon apostles had this argument at the centenary of Origin of Species being published by Charles Darwin.
Right.
But whatever his name, the sort of dissident apostle of the early 20th century.
Oh, Roberts?
Yes, he was all over this. They had high-level intellectual scientific apostles who absolutely had no problem with evolution.
Yeah, James E. Talmage was a trained geologist.
John Whitsoe. They had Hugh B. Brown. They had this conversation long ago. But then the church got taken over by ignorant, uneducated fundamentalists. Joseph Fielding Smith, no fault of his own. He grew up as a cowboy after his dad died young, and he had to do that to survive. But he didn't get educated. But because he was Mormon royalty, he got to pontificate about what Mormon doctrine is, write books about it. And against the opposition of the scientist apostles, he insisted that his specifically anti-evolution books were the curriculum at Brigham Young University and were the curriculum of the seminaries and institutes. And then his son-in-law, Bruce R. McConkie, did absolutely the same with Mormon doctrine. So we grew up in a world that had forgotten that this, and we had no internet to fact check this, completely forgotten that the church had already resolved it, that the first presidency had issued public statements decades earlier than before we were born, saying there is no incompatibility between evolution and God using that as his method of creation, as long as you sort of believe there's a deity behind it. So we grew up in a fundamentalist, high-demand religion that had forgotten its intellectual roots, that wasn't able to cope with the modern world when it had been earlier. I mean, it's just maddening. And it's super important to understand the state of Mormonism today, to know that that happens. So this is something I bang on about a lot in my podcast, to know the timeline, to know where the power was, who were these tyrants who stepped in to force their mindset on the whole church community and the curriculum being taught in its institutions and in its gospel doctrine lessons, so that we're still surrounded by people sitting there on a Sunday who think if you believe in evolution, you're an apostate. And they will tell you off. And they get to win every time because they're seen as the righteous ones who know the truth, when actually they're the apostates. It absolutely drives me nuts. So yeah, this crap is still being taught and they're not dealing with it. Even though there are so many wonderful Mormon resources to go to. You know, a Sunstone article by a BYU science teacher or someone was wonderful. It's saying you can even take Genesis if you want, if you were standing on the face of the earth as the scientific thing played out, in the fog of our atmosphere that hadn't cleared yet, all you would see is light and dark. And you'd see that light separating the dark because the sun is sort of filtering through this fog you're in at particular times of the day. Then you'll see the land forming and separating from the ocean. And then you'll see, you know, gradually these things will play out. If you were literally an eyewitness standing on the earth. I love that. That's one way to read it. Then there's Mormonism itself. Joseph Smith dealt with this. There's, of course, the second creation account in Genesis 2, or whatever it is, because it was a smush together of two different origin stories. And Joseph Smith interpreted that as the first one being a spiritual creation, like the theoretical plan. And then Genesis 2 is the order it actually happens, where man is created before the animals, and so on, or vice versa. And he actually engaged with this. It's part of his teachings and scriptures. Or the one that really makes sense is it's a beautiful poetic metaphor. The first 3 days in Genesis chapter 1 create 3 environments, and the next 3 days fill them with life. The first day, light and dark, an environment. The second day, sky and sea, an environment. Third day, land and sea, an environment. Fourth day, we go back to sun, moon, and stars are made to fill the light and the dark. I'm losing count now. Fifth day, birds in the sky, the firmament above, and sea life and fishes in the water underneath. And then on the sixth day, the land and the sea that's been separated are inhabited with plants and animals. And that for me is the one that makes the most sense, because it's a simple poetic narrative. You create 3 environments, then you people each one in the same sequence with something to live in them. The celestial world with the planets, the sky and the oceans, and then the land animals, and then humans come. So these are all ways to understand this. But the joy, if I was going to take from my year now of podcasting and researching this journey and this intellectual struggle, my great-grandmother was converted by James Talmage, and John and Leah Widtsoe corresponded with her to support her early faith. So accidentally, my family's journey in this church has been absolutely rooted, nailed to the intellectual scientific apostles, these giants of thought and education. And that has, I now realize, percolated throughout my family's Mormon culture. We are fierce intellectual Mormons who love it with integrity for that reason, you know. And Hugh B. Brown, I think it's in his talk, Man and What He May Become, at BYU, which you can find on the BYU Speeches website. It's one of the 2 or 3 talks they've got here. He was walking straight. It's the 1950s or 60s, where Brigham Young University was still persecuting and firing its science teachers for teaching evolution, and that is still a tension going on there now. He walked straight into that minefield and he kicked ass. And he said, if you want evolution, the Mormon journey tells you we progress to become like God. We start as something we weren't, and we become something steadily better step by step. That's fundamental to our religion. We are evolving. But also, he said, there are 2 tablets of stone written on by the finger of God, and they are both scriptures to Mormons. There is the tablets that Moses brought down from the mountain with the Torah, the law, these commandments. And he said the stony pages of the earth's crust, by which he means the fossil record, the science, the proof of what really happened in the ancient evolution of life on this planet. And he says they are both scripture to us.
Well, in fact, St. Augustine says the same thing.
Yeah.
You know,
why
he
did no one
about,
tell me that in seminary? It would have completely changed my world. And all the idiots sitting around, sorry, not idiots, but uninformed people sitting around me in gospel doctrine lessons who have no idea any of that happened.
Yeah, I didn't learn most of this stuff until I actually took geology and paleontology at BYU. I dabbled in that briefly, and the teacher said, here's how it is. In fact, there's a speech that Talmage gave from the pulpit of the tabernacle called The Earth and Man, in which he describes, and the fact that it was delivered in the tabernacle gives it a certain gravitas. And the geology department would have, Xerox copies of that speech that, anyone who wanted one could just come and ask for it. And I think they did it mostly to cheese off the people in the religious studies department, but which is fine with me. But yeah, I'm with you. I didn't learn about a lot of this stuff until I was in college, and it was infuriating.
I'm only finding it now. I'm in freaking 50. I'm livid. And I'm getting it from the distance and the anti-Mormons, the anti-Mormons. It's such a wasted opportunity. My only hope for the future of the church is that somehow we correct our timelines. One of our timelines went through institutional racism when the Book of Mormon is a massive anti-racist polemic. One of our timelines started off with true science is true religion, like the most useful couplet you could possibly have in the modern age. And there's still these fundamentalist idiots who trained by Joseph Fielding Smith and his minions to completely throw that opportunity in the bin, and we've destroyed ourselves intellectually and wasted so much time, even though at the same time plenty of Mormon scholars and deeply spiritual people have kept that flame alive and made it work and kept that hope. And that's the real Mormonism. We've got to get back to it, and fast, or we're stuffed. But I just, this is, again, as I keep saying, why I'm so excited to have this discussion, because I think it's not arcane intellectual fluff. It's not just, oh, I'm curious about history. This is fundamental to the soul of our religion, of every religion. How do you work with metaphorical creation myths and origin stories and truth claims and being in the information age? And I genuinely think Mormonism has the answer, because what it kind of says is, and the Book of Mormon says that it's got 2 Nephi 29, where it talks about how God has spoken to all the descendants of the children of Israel who scattered across the earth. And he said, and I shall speak to them and they shall write it. And then he runs out of those and he still says, and all the other nations of the earth, I will speak to them and they shall write it. So this is an invitation and permission to us all. I mean, the vision of Joseph Smith, the inclusive global scale of his vision at his best, or what he was being inspired to say, is there is no culture or religion on earth that we cannot learn from. And our founders said this. Joseph Smith said this. Brigham Young said this. All truth is Mormonism. If it comes from the scientists, it's our religion. If truth comes from the infidels, that's our religion. Our job is to send the elders out into the world and gather it all in. And that's a metaphor for us in our own heads to learn from all of it. Truth is truth. And that's the future-proof religion. The religion is the science. The mumbo jumbo, the superstition, the metaphorical origin stories are not the whole truth. Our religion has to be the truth of the scriptures written in the fossil record, but you can still have God within it, all of it.
What about for those who have deconstructed their faith and who no longer have an interest in not only Mormonism but religion in general? Is there a place for these origin myths, these origin stories in general, just just for civilization, for people? If you lose your faith in God, do we chuck out the scriptures? What relevance do they have?
Well, they probably won't have a lot of relevance because you'll stop reading them.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, you'll abandon them, and something else will take their place. And you know, for someone who no longer believes in God, that might be some kind of biological determinism or some kind of scientism, or it may be something entirely political. I mean, the thing about atheism is that it's one size fits all. I mean, you can be, you know, a good capitalist, a good humanitarian, a good fascist, a good child molester, and still be a good atheist, because atheism is silent on all those other things. You can say, you know, there is no God, but there's nothing that compels you in any one direction as far as how you live your life. And if you look historically, you know, I mean, they come in all shapes and sizes and colors and flavors. So, you know, something will step in, but you know, there's no guarantee as to which direction it's going to lead you in, and whether that direction is something that would be good for any of us, or it might not. I mean, I know some people who have abandoned their faith in God who still manage to lead pretty good lives. So, you know, it becomes kind of a crapshoot.
I guess what I'm thinking about is maybe the fact that the Jewish religion, when you no longer are affiliated necessarily with the worship of it, you are still culturally Jewish. I don't know. I guess I'm just curious about how then does the origin story of, does that make sense what I'm saying?
Absolutely, yeah. I've got some thoughts on that. Yeah. I think look at it as the collective wisdom of generations of humans from their lived experience. I think that gives it value. I think that gives these myths that have survived the test of time. And you know, taking the Jewish people, for example, through like unbelievable pressure, horror, victimization, tragedy, moments of glory, the whole shebang, you know. I mean, of all the people of Earth, they've been on a journey. And if you have with it from that a culture, stories to tell, how you frame your collective wisdom, that has value, because that is generations of, from a scientific point of view, this is a laboratory experiment. This is a whole culture of human beings, of millions of people who have learnt some stuff by doing it the hard way. And if they have a story to tell you, for goodness sake, sit down and listen, because that's a gift to you from the previous generations of humanity. And that is where you can get your wisdom to give you your ethical compass if you're atheist or whatever, you know, and want to be a good humanist, where you have values as a person that you can pass on and embed in your culture. Can I just share 2 books with you? So you noticed I did a run earlier. When I moved to Gravesend, I've been teaching in this town for years, but as soon as I actually moved here a few years ago, I suddenly got inducted to the secret intellectual world of my little town. And I was quite cross that I wasn't told about it before, but I was considered one of the ins, so I got invited. So in Britain, we have a national network called the Skeptics Club, and it's usually called Skeptics in the Pub. People meet in the pub sort of once a month, and they have an amazing speaker to come and present about something usually skeptical, like debunking a myth or challenging a paradigm that people have. And just the most amazing speakers. Ours is in a very polite little cafe that sells incredible cake. So I don't even have to get drunk to go to this thing. And we have had 2 wonderful speakers, and it kind of speaks to this. One was Lewis Dartnell, who wrote a book called The Knowledge, How to Rebuild Our World from Scratch, which was a Sunday Times bestseller.
I think I have that book.
Yay! There you go.
Yes.
So it's basically
fascinating.
saying, if science, so if the world collapses and you lose all your technology, there's some apocalyptic war, how are you going to rebuild and re-engineer the infrastructure that we're used to in our modern life? And one of the intriguing things he said, first of all, was you have to give up on oil, because to get oil, you have to dig very deep in really inconvenient places. So your first technology has to be how do you deconstruct your broken car to get energy from the wind and from other sources and so on. But it's a wonderful, I mean, I haven't read it, but I'm assuming I'll grab it from the house when a nuclear bomb drops and hope to rebuild civilization. But
you won't be disappointed.
Yeah. But the idea here is, of course, that to survive, a civilization needs a lot of knowledge. You need technology, you need rules, you need ethics, you need wisdom. And that is crucial for human beings to function in larger than 50 people groups, you know. The second amazing speaker we had was Lynn Kelly, who's Australian, and she was visiting Britain doing some research. It's called The Memory Code. And unlocking the secrets of the lives of the ancients and the power of the human mind. And her basic thing is, how is it that ancient cultures embedded vast amounts of knowledge and memory in their myths, in their stories, and in their physical rituals? And you have these mnemonics, these ideas of ways to memorize huge amounts of information, that these people who sort of invent a photographic memory will tell themselves a story to remember bits of information. I walked past a gate and there was a flower on the left, and I noticed the color of the sunset, and they attach information to each of those stages of the story. And she was really fascinated by these ancient rituals that involve going on journeys. So ritual processions around the Nazca lines, you know, these amazing lines in the deserts of Peru of the outlines of animals and gods. And the ritual was to walk along them in order to do that repeatedly. And she said, you know, she was here in Britain, looking at Stonehenge with these standing stones, but also these ritual avenues that you'd walk up. And there are shapes on the stones that might trigger a memory. And she was saying, the only way that these cultures without writing particularly managed to pass on vast amounts of information and knowledge was their magi, their shamans, their witch doctors, whatever, had to memorize huge amounts of information. And she, particularly being in Australia, is interested in the Aboriginals who make these kind of pallets of wood and stick things in them, hammer stones and stuff. And they use them as memories, that they attach loads of information. It's a tool for memorization. So her thing is, how can we unlock this in the classroom as educators? How can we use these skills of storytelling, of physical objects with things that prompt a memory that you've attached a memory to memorize and process information? So that was her sort of academic pursuit. But what
there's
she
a book that there's another book that speaks to that I think you might want to take a look at, and the author's name is Mary Carruthers, and the book is called The Book of Memory, and she examines this from the medieval standpoint. And she actually goes into some of the techniques that were used. So, like, one of the things, this was a wild Friday night at the monastery, where people could someone would throw out a number, 62. Okay, so I start with Psalm 62 and then another smaller number, let's say 5. So you start with the first word of verse 5 of Psalm 62, and then you recite the second word of the 6th verse of Psalm 62, and go on in that sequence.
Wow.
And what you end up with is a kind of a nonsense thing, which would be very funny, and I guess it was hilarious. It was one of those you had to be there kinds of things. But there are people today who can still do this. In fact, I spoke to a gentleman a couple of years ago who had encountered some Jewish scholars in New York who, if you gave them a verse, a book, a chapter, and a verse, and then a number, they could tell you what letter stood at that point. And if you took the text and drove a pin through that letter, they would be able to tell you which letters that pin penetrated on the succeeding 2 pages. So, those kinds of people, they still exist. It still happens.
Crazy, isn't it?
So
to come back to your So just to come back to your point, Jane, I think one way to absolutely value all of these stories from every culture is this is real lived wisdom here. This is scripture. And I love that the Book of Mormon has a verse that teaches us this. It's of course not one that the Pharisee control freaks would ever understand or appreciate, but I do, and other people might. And it's just wonderful. So treat this as, in a sense, history. The thing that Joseph Smith did with God was go sci-fi with him and go real. God lives near a star in our universe, like he's a physical alien being with superpowers and advanced intelligence and technology who exist in real space time, and has what we interpret as supernatural abilities. But one thing Mormonism does get right is God works with natural laws, not unnatural laws, to do whatever he does. He's just got a superior knowledge there. And there's a group of Mormons I need to find out more about, but they're the Mormon transhumanists. People would keep talking about Mormon transhumanists, and I was like, oh, they're probably like transcendentalists. I haven't got time to meditate and find my 12th chakra right now. But it's actually the opposite. Transhumanism is this idea that human beings will eventually evolve the technology to transcend the limitations of our body, that will become immortal, we'll download our minds into machines or whatever. And of course, science fiction has explored that idea in lots of ways with artificial intelligence and all kinds of stories of people kind of being downloaded into a computer network. But that is starting to sound to me like a really credible way for religion to go in the future. And it's something that Mormonism has been talking about all along. Joseph Smith was part of the post-scientific Enlightenment age, how much he realized it or not.
Well, you make a really important point here, Peter, which is in Mormonism, this world is about as real as it gets. We don't have this discrepancy or this disparity between, ugly, evil, awful, crass, crude matter and refined, gorgeous, beautiful, wonderful spirit.
Yeah.
This is it. This is the universe we have. Jane, I'm going to need to drop out in about 10 minutes. So just as a quick warning here.
Yeah, well, what we'll do is we'll just get to wrap up. I think what I'm hearing, what I'm appreciating is that we have wonderful cultural traditions of both tradition and dissent that we, that we. I'm thinking about my own experience here, as a Scot, as a, with a Celtic heritage, that as much as we celebrate freedom, we also remember the oppression. And I think when we have scripture, when we have origin stories, when we have these incredible, really, really fascinating works of art, of literature that speak to that tension, the idea of just throwing it away because I grew out of it, it's a thing that's able to go with my experience. That's what I really like. What I'd like to do then, just maybe in closing up, is, Peter, do you have any final question that you would like to ask Dr. Greaves, since we have him here? You are going to come back and join us, right, Dr. Greaves? We do have more.
Oh, of course. Yeah, absolutely.
So much more.
Yeah.
But, Peter, do you have
I have a lot of fun with these.
I just first of all, I just want to thank you so much. And I also discovered you years ago on the Rational Faiths podcast and absolutely loved it. So I just want to thank you for being really, for Jane, profoundly important on my journey. Also, David Bokovoy, who's sort of done similar things with biblical scholarship for a Mormon audience, in helping me to catch up with this world that Mormonism has missed, that the rest of Christianity has been doing for a long time. To point out that our articles of faith have always given us permission to do this. It says that the Bible's messed up. It says that I've got an article of faith. They taught us this as kids. The Book of Mormon should not, the Bible should not be taken as literally true. It's been messed about with by people with the limitations of their knowledge. We have permission to do this, to deconstruct it, to still believe that God is real in our universe, in a real place. No need to compromise any of that. But along the way, he works with human society. He works with us individually at each stage of our evolution, and he works with human society at each stage. Hence the Mormon concept of dispensations, and you get more knowledge with each one. And they match the, tribal society to national, to imperial at Jesus's time, and now to universal and scientific. We can do this. It is part of Mormonism. It shouldn't be a threat. And I loved really understanding Aboriginal dream time, this idea of the transition from the dream time to real history. And the Bible kind of does that. It's dream time up to Abraham. Then Abraham is a real person, in the narrative at least, in the place where writing was invented, the first civilization on earth to start writing stuff. Pow, God is there with Abraham, Ur of the Chaldees, and the Sumerian culture, and it goes on from there. And we can frame it like that and still find absolute value, that all these myths and stories are the collective wisdom of history. They're a gift to us from humanity, and that is easily as valuable as any other reason to value them and want to learn from them, because we do not have it all worked out, and they can teach us a lot. So I would just say, do you, in your experience, or ask with sort of Mormon scholars and so on, do you see any hope? Because I'm all about, we've only got a few years left to save the church because it's crashing fast, in part because we're not being intellectually credible. Do you see any hope among the apologists and the scholars to go on this journey? I know the Givens are already nuancing up a lot. They're effectively talking about the Book of Mormon being pseudographia, if you pay attention to what they're saying. I don't think the general authorities who still approve of them have the first clue what they're actually saying, because they're setting fire to McConkie Mormonism left, right, and centre, but they're getting away with it so far. What do you see any kind of, what would need to be the path, what would need to happen for the church to embrace this and cope, to fulfill the dream of our image?
Well, I don't think the church as it's constituted right now is going to make that transition. It's not going to make it easily because there's a huge amount of social momentum that's already been built up going in a particular direction. I think that if there is an answer, it's going to be that it's going to start with small groups, small communities that have formed in some way, people finding each other, sort of like people are finding each other on this podcast, and gradually forming their own traditions, their new stories. And that's where the gift of these stories, as you put it so correctly, they're a gift, but they're also a responsibility. It's up to each generation to take those stories and make something of them. And sometimes that involves creating new stories and new narratives. And I guess the answer to the question is really going to depend on the kinds of stories we come up with and how we decide to do it. Mormons are funny. I mean, they're so institutional, and yet they seem to be inoculated against forming communities outside of the usual conventional Mormon faith. I'm not sure how that's going to play out, but as for the institutional church, I think it's going to lag behind a long way, as it often has, and it's going to take a while. Whether they, I do believe that that Mormonism is going to survive. The question is, in what form? And that's really the big question. And that's the best I can do at this point. So,
thank you so much. Okay, well, I'm gonna just get you guys to wrap up if you have any final words. Before I get you guys to do that, we are going to be back hopefully in the next sort of short while. We'll announce it on social media, but we do want to talk about the impact of COP26 and what's happening with climate change. I think this is an excellent lead into that. So we're going to come back and talk about that. Next Wednesday night, we have some really special guests coming on who are going to share their story. We're going to announce that later on this evening. So we're looking forward to seeing you. And of course, Peter will be back with some Brit Vengers analysis and news of all of this stuff as it's unfolding. I think there's some stuff going on right now. We're really looking forward to sharing with you all. So Peter, do you have any closing thoughts you want to share? We've got a few minutes.
We've got as you mentioned, we've got Keith Erickson, who's the church's sort of official engagement with church history person in the country at the moment. He gave a really interesting presentation in Belfast last weekend, and he's doing 3 presentations this weekend from Preston, and it's being advertised as for the Europe area, so lots of people can tune in. The Zoom links are being circulated. But this is the front line of this attempt by the church to engage with people's questions. He'll take any question about church history. His answers aren't always wholly honest, let's say, but he's having a try, and he represents the best that the church is prepared to offer up in an official capacity. So do tune in, be aware this is happening. This is where the change will happen. They're now offering up an expert, and anyone in the church, it's not a private meeting, it's open to all of Europe, can ask a question, and he does his best to take them. He doesn't say, oh, you can't ask that question, and that's wonderful. So I do see that as a baby step to celebrate towards having an intellectually engaged religion, actually dealing with people's questions. And finally, I think the only other ingredient I'd just throw out there is Jungian psychology, which I'm not an expert about, but a really important part of psychology is Freud's student Jung, who kind of went with the metaphor thing, and the basis of his approach to psychology is that the reason why you have these recurring similarities in the origin stories and myths of cultures all over the world who never met each other is that it is part of human psychology to have these dreamtime ideas, these metaphors that come up in how we organize and think about our world. And that is just another witness, in a sense, to the fact that origin stories really are an important part of the human experience. They matter. And we, as you say, Dr. Greaves, we need to value them and treasure them. They are a responsibility to pass on to the next generations, as well as learning from, and to reframe to meet our needs as we encounter them. And it is an ongoing process. So I just wanted to sort of throw that out there, that this isn't just a religious, this is something in psychology, it's something in history, it's something in anthropology. And I'm just so grateful for the perspective and insight that you've offered us today. Thank you. Yeah.
Well, thank you. I don't have really anything to add to that except thank you and to be continued.
And we'll see you soon. Okay, everyone, thank you so much for your time. We'll be back next week. Have a good night.
All right.
Thank
Ciao.
you. Bye.